Every story has a version that makes it through the filter. The one that gets taught in schools. The one that lands in documentaries with sweeping orchestral scores and curated experts. The one that is clean enough to broadcast, comfortable enough to print, and vague enough to avoid the questions it cannot answer. Then, there is the other version. The one that lives in the primary sources. The one that does not fit the framing. The one that has been sitting in the archives for 14 centuries, waiting for someone to actually open them. This is that story. If you've been looking for the kind of analysis that goes to the source material rather than the summary, subscribe. What we document here is not the polished narrative. It is the record itself. We are going to examine 7 elements of early Islam that rarely appear together in the same frame. Not to construct a caricature, not to confirm anyone's prejudices, but because the pattern that emerges when you line them up is one that demands serious examination. The kind of examination that mainstream media tends to postpone indefinitely. Let us begin where the record begins. There is a name that appears at the center of early Islamic history, so frequently, and in such specific terms, that it cannot be passed over. Aisha, daughter of Abu Bakr, the closest companion of the Prophet Muhammad. The accounts of her marriage are not buried in obscure texts or disputed fragments. They appear in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, the 2 most authoritative hadith collections in all of Sunni Islam, classified by classical scholars as authentic. The narrations come from Aisha herself. The reported age at which the marriage was contracted and the age at which it was consummated have been debated for centuries, but the texts themselves are not in dispute. What is not debated is what happened next in the legal tradition. The 4 major Sunni schools of jurisprudence, the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali schools, along with mainstream Jafari Shia jurisprudence, have historically cited this marriage when addressing the minimum age of matrimony. The personal example of the Prophet in Islamic law is not advisory. It is prescriptive. His sunnah, his lived conduct, forms the second most authoritative source of Islamic legal guidance after the Quran itself. And so what might otherwise remain a historical footnote became something with legal gravity, an anchor point for determinations about what is permitted. The distance between that 7th century precedent and the present is shorter than most people assume. According to UNICEF, approximately 40 million child brides exist across the Middle East and North Africa, with the highest numbers concentrated in Sudan and Yemen. Every year, 700,000 additional girls in the MENA region are forced into child marriage. The connection between ancient religious legal precedent and contemporary law is not a matter of inference. It is documented. The theological architecture that tells a conservative cleric his position represents fidelity rather than cruelty, draws from a specific source. One marriage, one textual tradition, and a legal structure built on the principle that the Prophet's conduct is a model for all time. But that is the first thread. Pull it, and 5 more come with it. The second is older, wider, and even less discussed. Slavery is not unique to any single civilization. It appears in Rome, in China, in the pre-Columbian Americas, in ancient Greece. Acknowledging this is not deflection, it is context. What distinguishes any civilization's relationship to slavery is not whether it existed, but what the tradition did with it, how deeply it was embedded in theology, and how that theology shaped the timeline of abolition. In Islamic legal tradition, slavery was not merely tolerated, it was regulated in detail. The Quran itself references those whom your right hand possesses, a phrase used across multiple verses to describe captured women and enslaved individuals. The institution was not contradicted by revelation, it was incorporated into it. The 4 major Sunni legal schools developed extensive bodies of jurisprudence governing the purchase, sale, inheritance, discipline, and potential manumission of enslaved people. Concubinage was legal and regulated. Sexual relations with enslaved women captured in war were explicitly permitted under classical Islamic law. The scope of what this enabled across 14 centuries is staggering. Estimates of the total number of Black Africans transported from sub-Saharan Africa to the Arab world range from 6 to 10 million. Human trafficking across the Indian Ocean lasted far longer than the Atlantic trade and may have involved comparable numbers of enslaved people. Scholar Robert Collins has noted that approximately 11.3 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic between 1,450 and 1,900, while around 12.5 million were sent eastward to Asia between 800 and 1,900. That asymmetry in duration is the part that rarely makes it into the edited version. The Atlantic trade lasted roughly 4.5 centuries. The key difference lies in the duration of the trade. The Indian Ocean and Trans-Saharan systems stretched across more than a millennium. The journey could last up to 3 months, subjecting enslaved individuals to brutal conditions. It is estimated that 50% of the enslaved people in this trade died during transit. The moment of formal abolition also tells its own story. Saudi Arabia did not abolish slavery until 1962 under external diplomatic pressure. Mauritania, the last nation on earth to legally abolish the institution, did not do so until 1981. And according to human rights organizations, hereditary forms of servitude persist in Mauritania to this day. The legal infrastructure was not dismantled by an internal doctrinal movement. It was dismantled by external pressure, because the internal doctrine never generated an equivalent to the abolitionist movements that emerged from within Christian societies. If this pattern were isolated to one institution, it might be explained as the residue of a particular era, an artifact that the tradition eventually shed, but the pattern does not stop there. And here is where it gets unsettling: 79 years. That is how long it took from the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE to the arrival of Arab armies in Spain. 79 years to go from a trading community in the Arabian Peninsula to a military force that had dismantled two of the ancient world's great empires, the Byzantine in the west and the Sassanid Persian in the east, then crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and destroyed the Visigoth kingdom. No military expansion in recorded history moved that fast across that much territory. The question that gets avoided in polite academic circles is, what made it move that fast? The answer, documented by Arab historians of the period themselves, is that the ideological engine of early Islamic expansion was unlike anything the pre-Islamic Arab world had produced. Tribal raiding had always existed in the Arabian Peninsula. What changed was the theological reframing of that raiding into something new. Jihad, war against non-believers, framed as religious obligation with defined spiritual rewards for martyrs and defined material rewards, including land, women, and enslaved people, distributed according to fixed proportions established in the Quran itself. This was not merely an incentive structure, it was a theological transformation of violence into worship. And according to the chronicles written by Arab and non-Arab historians of the period, including the great historian al-Tabari, it worked precisely as designed. Cities that surrendered on terms were generally spared. Cities that resisted frequently faced mass execution, widespread enslavement of survivors, and the destruction or conversion of their religious sites. The Sassanid Persian civilization, one of the great intellectual and religious traditions of the ancient world, was effectively dismantled within 2 generations. The Zoroastrian fire temples were destroyed. The priesthood was dispersed. Most of the sacred texts were lost. A civilization that had produced some of the ancient world's most sophisticated philosophy, astronomy, and administrative governance was erased so thoroughly that most people today could not name a single Zoroastrian temple. The North African Christian communities that had flourished for centuries, the communities that produced Augustine of Hippo, that debated theology in councils whose decisions still shape global Christianity, began a slow demographic transformation that ended most of them. None of this is controversial among historians who specialize in the period. What is controversial is saying it out loud, in the same breath as the word Islam. But the pattern does not stop with the 7th century. It was retrieved repeatedly. And what was burned in the name of this pattern is the part that perhaps demands the most uncomfortable reckoning. There is a version of medieval history that positions the Islamic world as the great preserver of classical knowledge during Europe's so-called Dark Ages. And this version contains real truth. The Abbasid translation movement in Baghdad, centered around the House of Wisdom under Caliph al-Ma'mun from the 9th century onward, translated significant Greek, philosophical, medical, and mathematical texts into Arabic. That preservation was real and consequential. Avicenna's synthesis of Greek medicine with Islamic learning shaped European universities for centuries. Al-Khwarizmi's mathematical work gave us the word algorithm. But the same centuries that saw Aristotle preserved in Baghdad saw something else happen entirely in the lands being conquered. In 1193 CE, a Turkic military commander named Bakhtiar Khilji, known for invading Bihar and Bengal and destroying Nalanda University around 1193 CE, arrived in the region of Bihar in northern India. The Chinese traveler and scholar Xuanzang had documented Nalanda's grandeur in his writings, stating that over 10,000 monks and scholars resided within its vast compounds. The university possessed a massive library complex called Dharma Ganja, divided into 3 large buildings, containing priceless works on Buddhist texts, the Vedas, medicine, logic, mathematics, and astronomy. The Persian historian Minhaj-e-Siraj, in his chronicle, the Tabaqat-i-Nasiri, reported that thousands of monks were burned alive and thousands beheaded as Khilji tried to uproot Buddhism. The vast library, known as Dharma Gunj, was set ablaze. The fire is said to have raged for several months, consuming manuscripts containing centuries of knowledge across various fields of study. So in Baghdad, the scholars preserved Aristotle. In Bihar, the soldiers burned Nalanda. Both of these things happened. Both appear in the historical record. The question of which one defines the era depends entirely on where you were standing when the era occurred. If you were a monk in Bihar, the house of wisdom in Baghdad was not a comfort. The theological logic behind the destruction was not arbitrary. According to strict classical interpretations of Islamic law, non-Abrahamic sacred sites were categorized as centers of idolatry. Their destruction was not vandalism. It was piety. This is a distinction that the polished version of history quietly omits. If patterns like this connect across continents and centuries in ways you have not seen assembled before, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep investigation deserves to be seen. There is a feature of any empire or ideological system that tells you more about its internal architecture than almost anything else. And that feature is what happens when the founder dies. The Prophet Muhammad died in 632 CE without unambiguously designating a successor. The dispute that followed was not a minor doctrinal disagreement. It was a rupture that defined the next 14 centuries of Islamic political history. The first civil war within Islam, known as the First Fitna, produced a cascade of assassinations at the highest levels of the new state. Uthman, the third caliph, was killed in his home in 656 CE while reading the Quran. Ali, the fourth caliph, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, was assassinated while at prayer in 661 CE, and then came Karbala. In 680 CE, on the plains of what is now southern Iraq, a small group of Muslims led by Hussein ibn Ali, the grandson of the Prophet himself, was surrounded by a vastly superior Umayyad force, loyal to the Caliph Yazid. The water supply to Hussein's camp was cut off for days. Then the army moved in. Hussein and nearly all the men with him were killed. The women and children were taken to Damascus as captives. Karbala did not end the pattern. It became the symbol of the pattern. The defining trauma of Shia Islam, commemorated annually with mass mourning rituals across the Muslim world. A grandson of the founder killed by fellow Muslims within 50 years of the religion's emergence. The Sunni-Shia conflict that this rupture generated has not resolved in 14 centuries. Ottoman and Safavid empires converted vast stretches of Anatolia and the Iranian plateau into sectarian battlefields. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, which both governments interpreted in part through a Sunni-Shia lens, killed approximately 1 million people over 8 years. The proxy conflicts currently active in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq feature Sunni and Shia militias deliberately targeting each other's mosques, clergy, and civilian populations. Both sides citing the same foundational texts to justify the killing of the other. This is not a system with an external enemy problem. It is a system with a structural authority problem. When the central demand of a faith is total submission to divine will as interpreted by religious authority, any dispute over who constitutes that authority becomes, by definition, irresolvable through normal political negotiation. The dispute becomes theological. And theological disputes, unlike political ones, do not offer compromise. They offer heresy, which brings us to the question of gender, and to the most structurally embedded asymmetry in the entire system. The Quran is explicit in multiple places about the legal relationship between men and women. A man may have up to 4 wives. A woman is limited to 1 husband. In inheritance, a daughter receives half the share of a son. In financial testimony, the witness of a woman carries half the legal weight of that of a man. The classical hadith tradition, including narratives in Sahih al-Bukhari, contains descriptions of women as deficient in reason and religious practice, framed in the context of their reduced legal standing. These are not later cultural accretions that progressive scholars can easily separate from the core tradition. They are in the Quran itself. They are classified as divine revelation. The classical legal schools codified them into family law and applied them across the breadth of the Islamic world. Modern reformist scholars within the Muslim tradition, men and women both, argue that these provisions represented improvements over pre-Islamic Arabian practice and should be read as historically contextual rather than eternally prescriptive. This is a legitimate and serious scholarly tradition. It exists, it has produced important work, and it deserves acknowledgement. But it runs into a structural wall. Because in countries where classical Islamic jurisprudence remains the basis of family law, these asymmetries are not cultural habits that social reform can gradually displace. They are religious obligations. And reforming a religious obligation is not merely updating a custom. In a tradition that treats its core texts as the literal uncreated word of God, it is a form of apostasy, which leads to the final and most complete expression of the pattern. There's a rule in classical Islamic law that has no real equivalent in other major world religions as they are currently practiced. You are permitted to enter the faith. You are not permitted to leave it. The Hadith literature, including narratives classified as authentic in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, records the directive plainly: whoever changes his religion, kill him. The first application of this principle at state scale came immediately after the Prophet's death, when the Caliph Abu Bakr launched what Islamic history calls the Ridda Wars, the wars of apostasy, against Arab tribes that attempted to return to their previous beliefs following the Prophet's death. Those tribes were either brought back by force or destroyed. The 4 major Sunni legal schools and mainstream Shia jurisprudence all historically endorsed the death penalty for apostasy, with variations in procedure but not in the ultimate conclusion. In effect, there is a death penalty for expressing atheism or converting to another religion in at least 11 countries, all of which are Muslim majority. Apostasy is a criminal offense in 17 countries. According to the 2013 Pew Research Center report, 88% of Muslims in Egypt and 62% in Pakistan favor the death penalty for people who leave the Muslim religion. This is also the majority view among Muslims in Malaysia, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. The cases are not hypothetical. In 2006, an Afghan man named Abdul Rahman was arrested in Kabul for converting to Christianity during a period spent abroad. The prosecutor sought the death penalty. Under enormous international pressure, Afghan authorities eventually released him on procedural grounds, declaring him mentally unfit to stand trial. He was flown to asylum in Italy. That occurred under the government that preceded the Taliban. Under the current Taliban administration, the situation for converts is categorically worse. The structure this creates is unlike anything in the modern religious landscape. Other faiths have faced periods of violent enforcement against apostasy, but those periods are historically bounded. The Islamic legal architecture that mandates this outcome is not a medieval relic that the tradition discarded. It is an active legal framework in more than a dozen countries today. And in societies where formal law does not enforce it, informal enforcement by family or community frequently substitutes. The door opens in. It does not open out. Now, when you look at all 7 of these elements together, something becomes visible that is invisible when you examine any one of them in isolation. This is not a collection of unrelated incidents or regional customs that attach themselves to a religion from the outside. These elements share a common architecture. Islam emerged from its founding moment as simultaneously a religious system and a political system, embodied in a single figure who was simultaneously prophet, legislator, military commander, judge, and head of state. When that figure died, the fusion did not dissolve. It was codified into a legal tradition that treated the practices of 7th century Arabia, including the marriage customs of one specific man, as permanent divine legislation rather than historical context. It was codified into a theology of expansion that converted the pre-existing Arab culture of raiding into a sacred obligation with guaranteed metaphysical rewards. It generated a model of religious authority that made any internal challenge to that authority potentially capital, fueling the structural sectarian violence that has never fully ceased. And it produced gender and exit asymmetries so deeply embedded in the foundational texts that reform requires not policy adjustment, but what the tradition itself classifies as heresy. Reform does happen. It is happening. Indonesia, Tunisia, Morocco, and Turkey, under Ataturk, have each produced substantive reforms to family law and the relationship between religious authority and the state. Individual scholars across every century have produced serious reinterpretations that read the foundational texts as historically situated rather than universally prescriptive. These efforts are real, they matter, and they deserve acknowledgement. But every reformist movement within the tradition runs into the same wall that has stood since 632 CE. If the source text is the uncreated, unalterable Word of God, then modifying its implications is not modernization. It is, by the internal logic of the tradition, heresy. And the architecture that makes heresy potentially capital is the same architecture the reform is trying to modify. That is not an external critique. It is the internal tension the tradition itself has been navigating for 14 centuries. You have just watched an empire of the mind examined from the inside, from the primary sources, from the chronicles written by the participants themselves. This is what the archive actually contains. Not the polished summary, not the edited for comfort version, but the record as it stands. The question this leaves is not rhetorical, it is genuine. 14 centuries of evidence, primary sources, legal traditions, demographic patterns, and documented consequences sitting in libraries that anyone can access. So why is the version most people learned so different from the one those libraries contain? Is it diplomatic tact? Is it Western political convenience in an era of complex foreign policy calculations? Is it the sincere belief among many scholars that the less comfortable elements are not representative of the tradition as a whole? Or is it something more structural, a reluctance that is itself a product of the exit problem, the door that opens in and does not open out? Leave your answer in the comments. This question deserves a serious conversation. Empires of belief, like empires of stone, do not fall or transform in a single moment. They shift in patterns, slowly, then suddenly, under pressures that accumulate over centuries before they become visible. If you want to keep watching those patterns examined before the mainstream version catches up with what the archive already contains, subscribe. The next chapter is already loaded.